fees when you talk about deregulation. I assume you would still have some monitor on weight. And can the trucking industry benefit by using highways that I am paying for and may not be using the merchandise?
They don't now. You now have a gasoline tax which covers the costs of the highways. It is appropriate to charge for the use of the highways, of course. They ought not to get a subsidy. I am opposed to subsidies, and I'm opposed to the opposite of the excess taxes. But they do now pay for the use of the highway through the gasoline tax, and they should continue to do so. As to weight limits, that really has nothing to do with the ICC. That has to do with the capacity of different roads.
I want to understand you, though, that you're not such a purist as to be impractical. You don't think anybody's truck should drive over anybody's pavement if the construction isn't prepared to accept the weight.
No, of course not.
Okay.
Perfectly. But that applies not only to trucks, it applies to private cars, it applies to a private recreational vehicle. But what you ought to do is to allow anybody who wants to go into the business of trucking to do so. You know, there are people today who receive $100,000 a year to give somebody else permission to use their ICC right to carry freight from one point to another, people who make a very good living without owning a single truck. The total value of these special permits which have been given to trucking enterprises to carry freight amounts literally to billions of dollars. Now, General Motors and the trucking industry, when they come down to Washington and say we ought to continue regulation, do they say we ought to continue regulation in order to promote our interests? What do they say? They say the public will be hurt. They are affecting the trade for the public good. But do you think they're kidding themselves?
They're saying we don't want the wonderful individual people in middle America to be hurt. And you're saying that's not what they're...
They know they're not stupid.
They're not Santa Claus.
They're not Santa Claus. They are people who are promoting their own interest, and they're affecting the trade for the public good because that's the way to get things done. Nobody ever goes up to Congress and says, look, vote me a big bonanza of $100,000 because I'm a good man and I deserve $100,000 out of the public purse. No. He says you should subsidize X, Y, and Z because the poor middle-class Americans or the poor people in the slums will be benefit from it, by it. So you have two classes of people, the so-called do-gooders. You have the honest, sincere people, and they invariably end up being the front men for private interests they would never knowingly support. That's part of Adam's.
What's an example of that?
An example of that are the 19th century Ralph Naders who got the Interstate Commerce Commission established. They got the Interstate Commerce Commission established supposedly to protect the consumer. No. The do-gooder reformers, the Ralph Nader types, were sincere. They were interested in promoting the interests of the consumers. And they were complaining that the railroads were monopolies and they were charging too high freight rates, and we had to get the government in order to eliminate that exploitation of the consumer. But who benefited from it? The ICC was set up. The do-gooder, well-meaning reformers went on to their next reform, and the railroads took over the ICC. And they used the ICC to keep out competition, to raise rates rather than lower them. They used it in the 1920s to get the control of ICC extended to trucking because that was the most dangerous source of competition. So those well-meaning reformers, not because they were bad people, but they ended up being the front men for special interests. And you have that over and over again.
All right. All right. I know you've heard these.
Incidentally, I should point out that this
Adam
little
Smith
picture
tie
on here is Adam Smith.
Okay. All right. Look, the only frustrating part of a dialogue with you is I want the audience has a lot of questions for you too, and it's so hard to do this within the confines of this limited time frame. However, how do you and I know you've answered these questions so you can hear your teeth crack, but how do you prevent monopoly? You've got to have constraints on monopoly. Okay. And isn't United Airlines too big? And look what happened when they went on strike. And should Pan Am absorb national airlines, we're going to have 3 airlines when it's all over, and we're all going to be beholden to them. Everybody's going to be impersonal. You can see it now on the airlines. Nobody looks you in the eye anymore. And they're giving paper cups in first class. How's that for elitism?
Well, personally, I don't see any objection to paper cups. But let's go back. The problem with the kind of statement you're making is to distinguish what's true from what's not true. The plain fact is that the main restriction on the number of airlines has been the Civil Aeronautics Board. From the time the Civil Aeronautics Board took over control of the airlines in the 1930s until now, until the deregulation, they did not authorize a single new trunk line. The number of trunk lines was less.
Because they were owned by the airlines who didn't want more competition.
Of course. Now,
so the government became then an agency to help the existing airlines not to have to compete.
Exactly. Now, what happened with deregulation?
You filled every seat in the airplane.
And you had new airlines come in. The number of airlines has gone up, not down. It is true that there are some proposals to merge United and National. But there are also Pan Am and National, I'm sorry. But there are also a bunch of new airlines that are coming out. Here's World Airways, whom you never heard of before, that's offering these cheap fares.
Look at Freddie Laker.
Freddie Laker broke the transatlantic monopoly. So the fact is that the best protection of the consumer, the best offense against monopoly, let me put it another way. There's an old saying, if you want to catch a thief, you set a thief to catch him. If you want to catch a businessman monopoly, you set another businessman to break it down. You don't send a government civil servant after him. The most effective anti-monopoly legislation you could possibly have would be free trade.
Okay. Now answer this practical question, Professor Friedman. and there are some angry people who would say, come down from your academic tower and tell us how we're going to get automobile dealers who really care about servicing the car as much as they care about selling us the car. Tell us how we're going to get automobile dealers who sell us safety with the same vigor that they sell us cosmetics.
Well, if the public at large really wanted to buy safety rather than cosmetics, it would be in the self-interest of the automobile dealers to sell them safety. You have had some automobile companies that have concentrated on selling safety, and they have not done very well in the sales. You can't blame. Here you have, let me give you a very simple example. You have the so-called Superba car, which is built by the Checker company that produces Checker cabs. They emphasize safety. It's the safest car probably there is built in America. They haven't been able to sell very many. If the problem with your talk is that you're not talking in terms of what the consumer really wants as judged by what he's willing to pay for. You're talking in terms of what you think he ought to want.
I am also talking, okay, so the underpinning here, underneath your statement here is the stupid public want lambda tops and colors, and they put blue lights on these cars in the showrooms, and everybody says, yeah, I want one of those, like Pavlov's dog.
I'm not going to call them stupid. The public is entitled to buy what it wants to buy. Who am I to say whether those tastes are better or worse than my taste?
What's your conclusion on a person who's more interested in the style of a car than whether or not the baby's protected after the collision? Well, that's stupid.
I think he has every right to pursue his own objectives and his own tastes, and I have every right to try to persuade him he's wrong.
Okay.
But if I can't persuade him, do I have the right to force him? Now, you don't bring in the baby, because that raises another and an extraneous and very difficult issue. Because I will agree with you, he does not have the right
to put a baby like an egg in a crate and
That's right. That's a different question. A third-party effect is different.
I trust you wouldn't pass a law to oblige babies to be constrained in cars.
No, I probably would not. But I think that
You're not very comfortable in saying no to the question.
No, I'm comfortable. But what I would do is I would say that any parent parent ought to be subject to suit and to being sent to jail if a child has been damaged because of that parent's
Right. Are you willing to pay for the prosecutor that it's going to take to develop the evidence that the mother didn't place the baby properly in the car, and the bureaucracy that will accompany the enforcement of the law which says that you can go to jail if you don't?
Unfortunately, I have to pay for it. I'm not, as I say,
so there are limits to your free society.
I'm not an anarchist.
Okay.
I believe that government has a very important role, but it's a limited role.
Okay.
And because we've been trying to extend the role, we haven't been doing what government ought to do as well as it does, as it should. We've been doing a terrible job on what ought to be the first function of government. The first function of government is to protect the nation against foreign enemies and to protect individual citizens against assault by their fellow citizens. And we've been doing a terrible job on both ends.
And in that goal, you are aligned with John Stuart Mill.
Absolutely.
Not bad company, and I want to show you what I've taken out of your book.